Thank you. Thanks for everyone coming today and kind of taking time out of your day. I appreciate it. I think the main goal of today is going to be to give you a little bit of information and then to move into more of a discussion time. I think most of you will have heard from the bishop and from kind of various church functions that we have all been called to move into looking at affordable housing. We are particularly focused on under this new bishop. And so in my non-church life, I spend a lot of time around affordable housing because I'm a land use and real estate attorney. So in kind of looking at the options that are available to us, both um, professionally and then in my church life, I felt like it might be a good opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about what affordable housing means and then move into a conversation of what are stepping into that space and creating some change with the assets that we have and the resources that are available to us. So I'm going to move into doing a screen share for a quick PowerPoint presentation. I don't usually do this in Zoom. In my world, it's usually on Teams. So forgive me if there's a little bit of a kind of adjustment as we do this, but oh, Jenny, you have to let me do it.
I just realized that. Go ahead and try now and see if that works.
All right, great. So, all right. Let's see how this goes. Can you all see a PowerPoint screen right now? No.
Not yet.
No.
Okay. How about now?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, we got there. So I'm gonna start really quickly with a telling about what housing means in the context that we're discussing it. So I think for a lot of people, when they hear affordable housing, they can conflate it with low income housing, which are one of those projects that pejoratively are talked about as the projects or kind of government run housing that is really focused on very, very low income folks. What we're talking about here and what a lot of the opportunity for redevelopment is for religious organizations specifically is around serving people who are a few steps up on the income ladder, which are people who make about 60% of area median income, which really just looks at kind of an economic area and averages the overall income. What that means for us is that if we are moving into building a product that serves that level of income, we can access a lot of state subsidies and partnerships for doing kind of development of affordable housing to serve those folks. What we see when we talk about the housing crisis and the lack of affordable housing is that it pushes those people who are on the edge, who are working kind of what would historically be considered like a normal, not quite middle class income, who are at this point pretty well locked out of accessing the single family housing market, but who would typically have been able to start an apartment and move into a single family house, kind of that typical starter home. So right now for Salem, that means people who are making about $35,000 a year are in that category. So traditionally, that would have been people moving out of college into their first jobs. It would be kind of your typical blue collar worker, kind of those types of people who have stable income, but that income threshold is still lower than what they need to afford moving into their own home. Right now, for that income level, a typical market rate apartment is at about $1,300 a month, which shows up as being a significant portion of their income. And because of the most recent rent kind of stabilization measures, that income or that rental level is moving up consistently year over year. Last year, it moved up at a rate of 2%, which is lower than it has the past 2 years, but we're anticipating that moving up more quickly as kind of those rent stabilization measures hit more and more housing. So I think that the big takeaway from that is for a lot of people who historically were housed on their own, who were working independently and didn't need any type of subsidy in housing, it's becoming more and more difficult for them to access any level of housing. But for affordable housing in particular, there's a wait list of 2 to 3 years at this point, which means that there is a significant portion of our population that isn't able to move independently into housing. What we are hoping is kind of a supplement for that is at the state level, the governor is opening up a significant amount of funding to help provide more housing at this level. And the bishop and the conference have really focused on this as a potential avenue for our churches to step in and really help with that. And I think that one of the things that kind of integrates well with this when we look at intersectionality and kind of our call to be more equitable is that what we're seeing in a lot of the statistics around housing in general, people of color and BIPOC communities are constantly hit at a higher percentage than white people when they're looking for their access to housing. So this integrates really well into the mile with our call to eliminate racism and then also our call to love our neighbor. So kind of in that context, I reached out to a organization that I work with on other affordable housing projects in Salem, and who was the private developer on the Portsmouth Union Church project up in Portland that I think has been kind of put out there as a really representative project for what faith communities can do. And what they're seeing in providing viability for churches is they need to be at a point where the land is donated, which doesn't mean that we're giving away our land. What it means is we aren't charging them a fee to develop on top of it. And what that typically looks like in this type of situation is a long-term lease. And religious organizations are set up particularly well to take advantage of this type of model because we're an intergenerational organization. So we have the ability to forecast land over a long period of time and kind of contemplate using it for 120 years and just renewing those types of relationships over time. The next level of viability that they look at is making sure that if you are developing on church land, you're looking at units that are ideally one-bedroom unit. When you look at what the market need is for Salem in particular, 1 units are needed and 3-bedroom units are needed. There seems to be a subsaturation of 2-bedroom units. We're not really sure why that is, but it seems like ideally to serve the felt need of the community, you would be looking at either a 1-bedroom unit or a 3-bedroom unit. And because of kind of the income generation of these units, a 1-bedroom unit is more profitable than a 3-bedroom unit. So when working with a private developer, that becomes a consideration on their end, although it might not be a consideration on our end, beyond making sure that any project we have is viable. They also have a kind of cap on the level of parking they would provide. Ideally, for some of the sites that we've looked at, it would be less than 1 parking space per apartment, which
Can you
would
hear that?
be, sorry. Oh, so you would be looking at less than 1 parking space per unit, which is a little bit lower. So you would want to make sure that there's public transportation available. And then in looking at, in particular, the Jason Lee Las Naciones building, it would be making sure that the removal of any existing structures don't have something that is completely unexpected. For a building that is the age of some of our historic buildings, asbestos or that type of lead paint are not unexpected. That's kind of something that's already baked into the consideration, but it would mean something more like unstable soils or environmental contamination at a really significant level. When we looked at different options for what redevelopment would mean, particularly on the Jason Lee site, what we were able to calculate was that a project on that location would be eligible for between $2.4 and $5 million in subsidies from the state, which would mean that going into any development on that site, we would be able to offset actual development costs at that level. And then we could do some negotiation around what types of constraints we would want to place on that development, if any. So we worked on coming up with a couple of different conceptual plans. These are very conceptual. They're only for discussion. No decisions have been made. But we wanted to kind of get a sense of whether or not this was feasible for a property that we have that isn't being used for ministry currently. So what I'm going to do right now is move into option 1. And let me close out of this really quickly and see if I can show you. Well, I'll come back to this at the end, but you can kind of see this is the historic church building here. This is the Christian education building here. And then this area is currently a parking lot. There's nothing here other than a pretty decent parking lot in terms of kind of doesn't need a ton of work. It is what it is. If we looked at just redeveloping this portion, we could provide a total unit count of 12, which would include some 2-bedroom units, some 3-bedroom units, and would provide adequate parking. In City of Salem, you aren't technically required to provide parking anymore. However, for livability, having some parking on site just makes life a little bit easier for folks. So they do like to retain a little bit just so that there are some options there. This particular configuration would allow for a good amount of subsidy, but it is pretty small when we're looking at economies of scale for development. If this was converted into all 1-bedroom units, it would be more viable, but this is kind of the minimum that we could do and have redevelopment of this portion of the site be possible. Even under this metric, it raises some questions about the ability to actually fund this project because the unit count is so low. It's still a possibility, but it's likely that other projects coming in with more units being provided would take precedent. The second option would be the removal of the education building and developing some parking in front of that. All of these units, because there would be demolition costs associated with it, would need to be 1-bedroom units for this to work. Then we would retain the same 12 units over on this area. If we move to 1-bedroom units, again, that would be a little bit more viable, but this provides a good mix on site. Just because of the overall condition of the education building, it's pretty unlikely that it's redevelopable and reusable in its current configuration. It just has a lot of problems. And the ODC board has been trying to do repairs and kind of getting it to a point that it's usable. And we can't get it there in a manner that makes sense financially, given our other ministry options that we would like to look at. So when thinking about this particular option, that context of this building not really being usable, I think is an important context to have. The final option would be full redevelopment of the site. This option allows us to move up to potentially 45 units, maybe more if we redeveloped these units down here as 1-bedroom units. It would require the removal not only of the education wing, but also of the historic church. Removing the historic church, it means that we would have to go through a historic review, and the overall unit count is an increase, but I think we need to think about whether this part of the building is reusable. In a lot of ways, the historic building is in a lot better shape than the education wing. It has potential for use as common space or as community space. If we wanted to partner with other nonprofits to use that space as a service providing space, so a free clinic or some other of the food bank, if we could kind of justify having that ministry return, it has some potential for reuse as a building that serves the other residential units on site. So we kind of did this calculation to see what it would look like as a possibility, but both the people at Home First and I think the board I don't know how we feel about this overall. I think in this context, we do have to think about whether there is a possibility of using this site and likely dedicating more funds on our end to provide some type of redevelopment of the historic church, or whether we just want to lean in to providing housing as a service to the community and really focus on that particular ministry. So with those three options in mind, I was hoping that we could move into discussion and kind of look at these for a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to move us back into just the normal discussion grid so we can talk about it a little bit more communally. But I think that the board is really looking for some direction from the wider ODC community on how this feels as a potential ministry, whether we want to spend the mostly time and potentially resources redeveloping this site, or whether there is another option here that maybe we aren't seeing that the broader community would like us to explore.
I'd like to make a comment.
Go for it.
Well, first of all, the education building also has a historic designation. So if you would want to redevelop that, you would still have to go through a historic review and approval from the city. they charge a fee, but I'm not sure you knew that or not. It's not very obvious because obviously the church is historic, but you wouldn't think the education building was just looking at it, but it actually is.
That's interesting because it isn't mapped on the historic resource for the
Yeah.
city. So
It's a
I
local,
wonder where that is.
it's a local designation.
Right.
Also, I noticed you maintain the roadway. And I wonder if you could reconfigure the roadway access. That would be a lot of space that you could use. And I don't know if what thought you've given to that.
That roadway is an alley, so it would have to be vacated by the city in order to redevelop it. So that's why it's kind of left there, because it's the city's property. It runs through that whole block.
Yeah, maybe you could turn it and take it through the new parking lot behind the proposed units, and that would give you some more space anyway. It's possible you could look into that.
Yeah, I think if we got into the point where we were doing civil design, we would have the ability to look at reconfiguration more closely and other options.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to abandon reconstructing the education building until you're absolutely sure it can't be done. That seems like such an more easy and cheaper alternative.
Margaret, I've got a question.
Go ahead.
It's Dan Pitney. In thinking about the properties of our open door churches, we have other sites that have undeveloped property that seems like would be a potential. I think particularly of the Trinity property. Is there a reason, and I'm just thinking about cost affordability, developing on undeveloped land versus the Jason Lee site, which would require some demolition. Have those been looked at and talked about, and why would we do the Jason Lee site over undeveloped property?
The reason that we're looking first at the Jason Lee project or property is mostly because it's at this point not being used by any particular ministry. So it's much easier to redevelop just because there's no one actively using it. And then it also doesn't, the Jason Lee property is zoned multifamily already. So that means that the cost of development on that site are going to be different than the cost of development on Trinity, which is in the county. In terms of like the possibility for redeveloping, I think that both sites would be possible, but there are going to be costs associated with developing at Trinity that won't be present at Jason Lee, not only because of the specific zoning designation, but also because of the level of services that are available to the property. So I don't think it's we do one or the other, and Trinity has an existing congregation that kind of is still in charge of their property. Jason Lee is an ODC property that's kind of a common property where all of us can get engaged and involved and kind of work on it together.
Okay, thank you.
Paul?
With regard to rehabilitating the education wing, one of the things we considered is it appeared very likely that the amount of work that would have to be done to make that building usable would exceed a limit that would push us into meeting current code, which would make extremely excessive redoing. For instance, in the upper rooms, there's a single outlet in a room, and the wiring would have to be almost completely redone to meet code.
And there's also asbestos in basically every surface in the education wing. And when you get to asbestos levels at that level, often taking the building out is less expensive because of the cost of abatement. So it seems pretty unlikely, kind of from the people that both the ODC trustees have talked to, and then Rick, when he was the executive director, it seems unlikely that it's possible to redevelop that space in a feasible way. Ruth?
Hi, I love that we're talking about adding affordable housing to a city that's where the numbers are dwindling for affordable housing, and being able to use our church property resources to do that, particularly being that we're not using those buildings. So, or not using particularly the education wing, and being able to add that housing to those, like option 2, the 2 sections. Have we done any reach out at all? Just probing to see if other faith communities are interested in working together within that the Jason Lee building, or is it just very preliminary on that point?
In terms of what kind of working and having services there, or taking over the building? Well,
Is that something that's just kind of, you mentioned earlier that looking at like what would it look like if we kept just the Jason Lee? Would it turn back into the sanctuary and keep that, or would it be like what are some of the ideas that you guys have had just beginning to brainstorm?
yeah, I think that would be, so in terms of getting the site redeveloped, if that was a direction that we ended up going, it would be 2 to 3 years out. So it's a little, it would be challenging to kind of get users of that building set up. At this stage, we would probably need to kind of start looking at what those options are. It might be an option for the Las Naciones congregation to move back into that space and be the primary user of that sanctuary and have an office there. It would be more part of the conversation once we figured out what you could viably do in that space and what types of repairs you would have to do to get it to a degree that it was usable kind of in its new configuration. So no, we haven't, because it's still a ways out. But I think that once we had an idea of what the configuration of the property would look like at the end of that development, we could start kind of either re-identifying groups to move in or working with local nonprofit partners to find a use for that space.
And I had heard about the historic designation on the city level of the other building, and it was kind of oddly done or something.
Yeah,
because they aren't at the same level, but
yeah, I'll need to double check that with the historic designation committee at the city, because my understanding was the designation was only on the historic building, and that for both local and national. So I don't know about that one. I'll have to look into it, and it would be something.
Or it's urban legend, right?
Well, I do know that there was a local designation on the historic building as well. So it's something that's out there. And David would know since he put the solar panels up.
Yeah, they made me apply for a permit, a historic permit on the education building. So they're the ones that told me it was historic. I wanted to ask another question. The subsidy, is that just for construction, or would that be available for maintenance work and for management? I imagine there'd be a long-term cost associated with it also.
So typically, what we would do in this situation and what other congregations who have developed affordable housing on their sites have done is that you don't own the affordable housing units themselves after development. You own the ground and you have the owners of the affordable housing pay the church for the use of the ground, but they are responsible for building, maintaining, filling, and organizing all of the tenants on site. So there aren't long-term maintenance costs or obligations associated with the affordable housing buildings because they aren't the churches until the end of that ground lease term. So 100 years from now, you then own the ground and you own the building, and maybe you continue to lease it if that organization still exists, or then the church does have these affordable housing components and can decide what to do with them going forward. Usually what you would require in that ground lease is maintenance provisions for the owner of the affordable housing units and inspection rights to make sure that you're able to go in and say, all right, these are being well maintained. You're using a portion of your revenue to properly update and make sure that everything is in place. Those points are negotiable, but that's usually how this particular situation would work. The historic building would be another question. And if we were repurposing the historic building, we wouldn't be able to access the affordable housing subsidies, but we might be able to do some type of grant work for revitalization and kind of service providing space in that area. It would just be different. Barb?
Yeah, I was just listening to all the conversations, and after hearing from David saying about the education building, that kind of put my mind at ease for one of the questions, because it made me think, what is that, if you were to use the education building, where does that put all the offices that of the office work and people who work in the office, where does that put them? And where would it put the music department? You know, if you were to dismantle the education building, since we're kind of attached to it.
Are you talking about the Jason Lee site or the
No,
first Salem site?
our education building, our education wing.
We're not talking about taking down the first Salem education building.
Oh, which education bill? I've been out of the loop about the last few months since my surgery in December. What education building are you talking about then?
At Jason Lee.
Okay. And the other point is, I kind of like the first one. That is the one that's behind our building, First Church building.
No, that's also at Jason Lee.
Also, all right, okay. I apologize. Excuse me.
You're totally fine. Claudia? Oh, no. I think she just dropped.
There we go.
Oh.
I wanted to just say that I'm in favor of the number 2 option. I think that I was concerned. I don't think we should have all 1-bedroom units, because we're trying to deal with families as well as individuals. And I thought that was and using the education, where the education building is, using that land. And I also think, you know, this is a very good place to put this kind of housing, because it's close to the city center, and it's on, I mean, Salem doesn't have the bus routes that Portland does, but it's on the bus routes that are available much easier. And I think it might even, if we did something to spruce up our property there, that it may lead to other people making some changes in that area too that would benefit the community. So, and the idea of using the historic building as a community center or a place for nonprofits, and maybe even having a food pantry back in there, that would, that would all be good. And my understanding is that if we had nonprofits, they would also be rent payers, so that that we would be making some income that would help sustain that building too. So just wanted to give my approval.
Thanks, Claudia. Pastor Jenny?
Yeah, I was reminded at one of our housing meetings, some of the other projects around the denomination, they chose a certain population that they most wanted to house. So some of them were revolved around seniors, got the priority. I think one of the ones in Portland, it was the LGBTQ community that got priority. So that was new to me, that you can have like
LGBTQ seniors.
no, right. That we could discern as ODC, here's one population we especially want to care for and love. It doesn't mean we don't love everyone, yada, yada, but that would be a really beautiful way to focus. And then you could say we focus on families, and then that would lean you toward the 3-bedroom, or we're okay doing single folks and then the 1-bedroom. So yeah, there's a lot of creativity here too. That's kind of cool.
Cindy?
I put this in the chat too, but the Salem Missionary Alliance Church has a medical clinic at Broadway Commons, and they have a food bank, and they're not very far away. So I'm not sure that those particular services would be the best choices if the old church was left there and used for something. That's all.
Hey, Margaret,
Yeah.
I'm too dumb to know how to raise my hand on the screen. If you talk about communities of wanting to serve, I would go back to the original vision for Jason Lee when we closed the Jason Lee site, and we really gave that over to the Hispanic community. The original vision was that a quarter of our population are Hispanic, and we really had no ministry to Hispanic people as United Methodists in the city. So the vision was to develop a congregation there, but to open up the whole site for a community resource center for the Hispanic population. And we'd actually began the process at one time, having 2 other organizations beginning to move into that facility. At the time, there was a Ukrainian congregation there. And anyway, so I would just throw that idea out there again. When we closed Jason Lee, it was really a transition to, now we're going to, as United Methodists, be in ministry to the Hispanic population of our community. And I would love to see that as a possibility as we begin thinking about the continued use of that site, whether it's for a community center and or when we're talking about specific groups of people for housing. So I just lift that up again.
Yeah, and I think my comments were just kind of illustrative. That would be something that we would want to look at really intentionally, if that's something that we're going to dedicate resources to and make sure that it meets a need in the community. And really, we'll have to have a lot more conversations about what type of, if we want to designate a community, what that community looks like, how we as ODC identify what particular population we want to focus around. So I think that those are great comments. And that's something that we can definitely look at building this project around, if this is a direction that we want to head in. Nancy?
Thanks, Margaret. I appreciate what Pastor Dan just said, but I'm also a little bit fearful of how there seems to be a lot of conversation of how to save one or two of these buildings. I'm a great proponent in letting go of old buildings for two reasons. One, I worked in local government for 29 years, and I'm kind of aware of local ordinances and protection as far as fire and public safety is concerned, and that these can be very difficult things to overcome when you've got such an old building. Second, I think we need to focus foremost on what are the priorities of our ministry? Who are we trying to serve? And don't try to save the old buildings unless we know we can use them in a cost-effective way. I think we need to let go of the past as much as we can so that we can serve the future.
Thanks, Nancy. Karna?
There we go. I wanted to dovetail on what Nancy just said. I think I must have missed something because I was under the impression that all of the Jason Lee buildings were basically uninhabitable, and that the effort it would take both monetarily and otherwise to bring them up to a point of being safe and usable was prohibitive. And so I'm confused about why we're entertaining the thought of keeping one or both of those buildings when that was the message I thought I heard.
I would say the education building is not usable at all. And because it's tied to the historic church, it creates a situation where it makes the historic church just cost prohibitive to run at this point because of the inefficiencies in heating and the issues with the roof. And there, with a significant amount of vacancy in the property generally, it is unusable for a lot of reasons. It's possible, I think, in looking at the condition of both buildings, it would be possible to save the historic building if that was a felt need of people in ODC. And so we wanted to be conscious that there is Methodist history here and people might feel strongly about wanting to retain the buildings. If that's not the case, we can figure out if taking both of them down is cost effective and a possibility, and that might make this a lot easier. We just want to be conscious that maybe that's not the way that people would like to go. So we're trying to get feedback. So thank you for kind of saying that it's okay to take it down, both you and Nancy. If that is a possibility, I think it could potentially open up more opportunity here. Pastor Deb, and then Shirley.
Thank you. First off, thank you for the diagrams of the options. That's really helpful for those of us that are visual learners. I noticed it was Pastor Jenny and Pastor Dan that brought up about maybe considering particular constituencies of our focus, perhaps. I would just say I was really enlightened working with the Mary and Pope Food Share, of their knowledge of where underserved populations are in Salem and what underserved populations there are. So I would just trust that it would be not our thinking that in 2026, this is the best constituency who has needs. So, I would just look forward to partnering with whoever really has that good data before making any kind of particular direction towards a constituency. That's all.
Yeah, I think that's a good comment. And what I see a lot professionally is that oftentimes it's better to not place restrictions on these types of projects because populations and demographics shift so much over time. So there may be a way to build in flexibility around that if we really felt called to serve a specific population. But it might be that that's not like the best way to approach it, and getting information about what best practices are, I think, is important, even when we're making decisions with the best intentions. Chuck?
I'm with Pastor Dan. I don't know how to put that hand up, but anyway, a couple of questions. One, how tall are these models that you that were suggested? Are we talking 2 levels or 3, or do you know?
I believe it's 3, just because it's almost always 3. Once you get above 3, you have to do additional engineering that adds additional cost.
Well, and elevators and such.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
No mention has been made of the old parsonage house, the house that sits beside the education wing there. Is that something we really want to keep, or is that open for discussion?
Everything is open for discussion.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't something that we had included in the schematics, just because it is being currently used in a way that aligns with our mission and ministry. So, and it is self-sustaining. So it in terms of just kind of priorities, wasn't included in this particular visioning. If we got really serious about looking at this as a direction we wanted to head in, taking a look at that house and figuring out if redevelopment of that parcel is an option. It's just not. For the most part, the reason that we feel like we need to act on the larger parcel is because it's at a point where it's a liability. So we were looking at building this project in a way that addresses the liability while also providing a mission and ministry opportunity. Nothing's set in stone. If it seems feasible to redevelop it, and we have a conversation with the people running Oxford House right now and find out that there's a way that we could serve that community just as efficiently by moving them into a segment of the units that are built on the property, that's an option. But that's kind of we've decided to make this step forward, and we're doing this and really looking at possibilities and calculations and subsidies at that point. Shirley? You're muted.
Pardon me. One thing I'd like to add to the pot, sorry, but one way to gain more land is to take the Jason Lee Church and let that be developed for housing, but put a memorial or something in a corner of it to memorialize, Jason Lee. That would allow you more development space, but honor Jason Lee.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and having some type of kind of memorialization, not only of Jason Lee, but of kind of that congregation and what they did would be great. Dave?
Another one who doesn't know how to raise an electronic hand. Maybe you could explain it to us all when we're done. But I wanted to say about the solar panels on the education building. They are not attached to the roof. They're just weighted down because we didn't want to make holes in that membrane. The place you could most easily move them to would be the administrative wing of First Church or there might be room on the education wing, but there is room for sure on the administrative wing, and they could just be relocated without much expense or effort. So they would be, and they're needed. That church, First Church, doesn't produce as much power as it uses. So they would be needed there. So it wouldn't be a waste.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. And just to add to that, ODC had looked at replacing that education wing roof, and we would have to take them down, store them, and then put them back on. So moving them makes the most sense from a financial standpoint instead of trying to kind of reconfigure them onto the existing roofs.
So how do you raise your hand electronically?
So you can set it up so that your Zoom senses it for you. And if not, it's a little bit different on everybody's screen, I have learned. And I am also realizing that it would take me a while to figure it out.
Okay.
On this one, because I don't ever use this computer. But is it if you look at the bottom of your screen, there should be a reactions. It's like a smiley face with a star at the top. If you click on that, raise hand will be a function. And then there are all types of things. Are people, Ruth, are you raising your hand? Or I can't.
Yeah, I actually was. Well, I was going to say the same thing, but I just wanted to piggyback on the other people who talked about taking down Jason Lee. I'm definitely not opposed to that as far as safety, energy use, efficiency, and what it could be used for. But I definitely want to honor the people who and work with the people who, if that's the decision we went with, to make sure that they know that we're trying to do this not to get rid of heritage, but to create something new for people to find that affordable home and to basically honor the process that we go through. That was all.
Thank you. Pastor Jenny.
One thing that's really cool about the Greater Northwest area and our new bishop is they've assigned one of our colleagues that part of his job, his name is Brett, part of his job is to go around and help churches do this exact process. So we've been chatting with them about the resources available, and they have folks who can come and spend a day with us doing workshops, digging in deeper to all of kind of the detail questions. But one of the things I was so struck that they do, I mean, I'm a pastor, so I'm going to love this part, but they do gatherings on the land, and you do some like prayer work and listening work, like to the land. And you kind of in a way ask the land what it wants to be. And that might be a little woo-woo for some of you. That's okay. But there is something really beautiful and spiritual about stewarding the land. And so maybe, maybe down the road, there's a day where some of us gather on Jason Lee property or on any property at some day. And we just do some prayer and reflection and wondering and dreaming. That's kind of cool to see what might come up in that kind of space as well.
Yeah. Karna?
I just would hope, since we were fortunate enough at Morningside to have some of the original Jason Lee members move to our congregation, I would hope that we would for sure kind of almost give them priority a little bit in terms of the thoughts that they have for the use of this land, and maybe that's already been done, but if not, I would hope that whether it be a written survey, because I know some of those folks may not be real computer savvy, or just not using a computer as much, but something like that would allow them to have a part in this would be really I think it would be well received.
Yeah, and I think we were hoping that we would pull people into this meeting, but I agree, we want to make sure that anyone who has a real historic tie to this property feels good about this project. We want everyone to feel good about it, but we do want to acknowledge that there are people who, you know, this was their church home for a long time, and making sure that they feel good about what the next phase for this property is. So it seems like people are mostly on board with this. Are there any big concerns about kind of what this means? Any kind of feelings of unease? Or I just want to make sure that we're moving forward in a way where people feel like they're being invited to engage in the process and feeling heard. So we're trying to be as open and transparent as is possible in an area ministry where there are tons of people and everyone's schedule is a little bit different. So if you hear people who are concerned about this, if you can point them towards us, that would be really helpful for us, because we aren't at all places all of the time. Dave, did you have a comment?
Yes. What is it? Would you talk about what this means church-wise? Would Jason Lee be closed? And if so, I understand they have quite a sizable monetary endowment. What would happen to that? And
Jason,
just what are the church implications of going this route?
so Jason Lee has been closed for quite a while. It was being used as Las Naciones in the interim, and they are being relocated out of that space into First for the time being, hopefully for a good long while. But if this space became available again to worship in, they would get first priority for moving back into it. So it, other than the Las Naciones congregation, it doesn't have a current worshiping congregation in it as of March 23rd. So there's all of their endowments, a lot of which were designated for new ministry in this area, are ODC endowments at this point. There's a youth one that is managed by the conference that we get disbursements from, but all of that money has already been moved to ODC. Along with the property. The property is owned by ODC. And that's part of the reason, to go back to Pastor Dan's earlier comment, that's part of the reason this is the starting point, because it doesn't have a current operating church that's using it in the way that we think of typical Methodist churches using a building. The Las Naciones church was operating there, and they had a physical presence there a good amount of the time, but they don't use it to the extent that our other campuses are being used right now. So this redevelopment is not, it has caused some disruptions for people who were there, but after this month, it isn't being used by anyone. June?
Sorry. Thank you for doing this. And could you take a little time to share what has happened with the other tenants on the Jason Lee property, and the status and the future and etc.?
Yes. So the Las Naciones congregation is moving to First Church. They're working through the details of that right now, but will be worshiping in the Micah building in Suite 150, which, if you're familiar with First, historically is where the Baha'i community was located for a long time. So they'll be taking that space. The Jason Lee Food Bank is being closed because I think someone mentioned earlier there's a food bank that's being operated out of the Broadway Common House. Marion Polk Food Share felt like relocating it didn't make sense for the way that their organization kind of identifies needed areas. So it's no longer operating. I think some people have found their way over to Lord's Cupboard. Some people are looking for what their next opportunity for volunteer work is. I know that CHP is working on finding a new location, and I don't believe they have found one yet, but they are working on finding a new one. So we've had some interaction with helping them find a new location, but it hasn't happened quite yet.
Thank you.
Well, we're at the hour mark, and I know that this is a Sunday kind of evening, early afternoon or late afternoon project for you all. So I do want to be kind of conscious of people's time and let people go. But if there are any questions, you have concerns, if there's information that you want to know about, this is going to be something that we're going to be talking about for a while. The next step is kind of figuring out what ODC, the ODC board wants to do in terms of feasibility. We're kind of in the sweet spot for funding right now. So we're likely going to move into looking for funding for this site, even though we haven't made a decision yet, and just kind of continue to work through the discernment process around that. So if you're in a position where you see funding applications come in, doesn't necessarily mean that we've made a decision to go in this direction. It's just making sure that we're in the cycle for being awarded funds if this is a direction we want to head in. This will be a very long process. It takes 2 to 3 years to get multifamily development on the market. So even just getting in the queue for funding is a step that we really don't want to delay too much, but it is a process that we want to dedicate the right amount of time to, and we want to make sure that people are comfortable with it and that it's going to be successful if this is a direction that we end up heading in. So if you'd like to be involved, if you have questions, if you want to volunteer some time to kind of going to meetings and doing some of that discernment work, we would love to have you. My contact information is everywhere. You can reach out to your campus pastor and your ODC board reps and just kind of make sure that you let us know that you want to be involved in the process, and we'll make sure that you're looped in. The website that Pastor Jenny set up where the Zoom link was will have updates on it so that you can kind of go to that one spot and see more information. So kind of stay involved. Let us know if there are other people we need to talk to. We do want this to be a collaborative ODC project. All right. Pastor Jenny, do you want to close us out in prayer?
Sure. Friends, thank you again for just giving a bit of your time, and we will post the replay of this on that site on Open Door Churches and send it out to the email newsletter. So if you had someone that wanted to be here, make sure you send this their way, and I'll put contact info there so it's right there close by to let us know ideas and thoughts. Yeah, let's pray. Oh, good and gracious God, what curious, exciting, and interesting conversations we get to have today. Continue to guide us. May we be faithful to the land and resource and people we are here to steward. God, we really do trust that doors open when the time is right. And so continue to guide us forward. May we go as one body, continuing to be honest and discerning and wise, checking in with all the resources and availability of things at our disposal. But God, ultimately, would you continue to open all the doors if this is a thing that you want us to continue to explore? We are so thankful for Margaret, especially, and the unique lens that she brings to this work as she helps guide us forward. In your son's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.